Clara Bennett's boots hadn't even settled into the dirt before she heard it, a man's voice cracking as he told a stranger on horseback that his children would be gone within the month. She froze, suitcase still in her hand. 5 faces stared at her from the porch, thin and frightened, while their father stood between them and a man holding papers that could tear the family apart forever. She had traveled 300 miles to be a housekeeper. Nobody told her she'd arrived just in time to stop 5 children from losing the only home they had left. Before we go any further, if stories about broken families finding their way back to love mean something to you, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me, clear through to the end. And do me a kindness, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the porch of the Whitaker Ranch and the moment Clara Bennett's whole life changed. 3 weeks earlier, Clara stood in the front room of a boarding house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, holding a letter she'd already read 4 times. "You can't keep me on past the month, Mrs. Foss," she said. "I understand." The landlady wouldn't look at her. "It ain't personal, Clara. I've got my own daughter coming to live with me now. I need the room." "I know. You'll find something." Clara folded the letter and set it on the table beside her few coins. "I always do." She didn't say the rest of it out loud, that she was 27 years old, that her mother had died of fever 6 years back, and her father a year after, worn down from grief more than sickness, and that in all that time she'd nursed 2 sick aunts, cooked in 3 different houses, and never once had a place that was truly hers to keep. She didn't say it, because saying it wouldn't change it. Nothing ever had. That evening, she found the advertisement in the back pages of a newspaper someone had left on a bench. "Wanted housekeeper for respectable ranch household, Montana territory. Steady wages, room and board provided. Must be capable, hard-working, of good character. Wright T. Whitaker, Larkspur, Montana." She wrote back that same night. She didn't have much to lose. The reply came faster than she expected, short and plain. "Miss Bennett, position is yours if you still want it. Train fare enclosed. Come as soon as you're able. T. Whitaker." There was no warmth in it, no detail about the house, the town, the family. Just a plain offer and a train ticket. Clara told herself that was a good sign. A man who wasted no words was a man who wasted no money, and a man who paid fair wages on time was worth 300 miles of travel. She was wrong about how simple it would be. She just didn't know it yet. The train ride west took 4 days. The stagecoach after that took 2 more, rattling over roads that turned to mud the moment the sky opened up. On the second night, the wheel axle cracked somewhere in open country, and the driver cursed under his breath and told the 4 passengers they'd be sleeping in the coach until first light. An older woman across from Clara, wrapped tight in a wool shawl, studied her for a long moment. "You're headed to Larkspur?" "Yes, ma'am." "Whitaker Ranch." Clara's stomach tightened. "You know it. Everybody around here knows it." The woman lowered her voice like she was passing along something sacred. "Thomas Whitaker buried his wife 2 years back. Fever took her quick 3 days and she was gone. Left him with 5 young ones and no notion how to raise 'em. 5. Clara's throat went dry. The letter only mentioned a housekeeper's position. The woman gave a short, humorless laugh. "I reckon a man writing an advertisement leaves out whatever he's ashamed of. 2 housekeepers before you already come and gone. One lasted 11 days. Told folks in town those children would run a saint out of patience, God rest whoever's next." Clara said nothing. She looked out at the black shape of the plains and told herself the woman was exaggerating. That gossip always grew teeth. It didn't have to begin with. But she didn't sleep the rest of that night, and when the sun came up gray and cold, she found herself gripping her suitcase like it might be the only steady thing left in her life. The final stretch to the ranch was on the back of a supply wagon, driven by a boy no older than 16, hired to fetch her from the depot. He didn't talk much, just pointed once toward a house sitting low against the hills and said, "That's it. That's Whitaker land." As they came up the drive, Clara heard raised voices before she saw a single face. You've had 2 years, Whitaker. A man on horseback, dressed too fine for ranch country, sat with the kind of stillness that came from a man used to being obeyed. The bank's been more than patient with that note. I don't make the rules on how long patience lasts. I paid what I could, Callahan. Thomas Whitaker's voice was low, rough, and tired in a way that went deeper than one bad season. I lost half my herd to that same fever that took my wife. Give me till spring. Spring won't matter if there's nothing left standing to give it to. Callahan's gaze flicked cold and deliberate toward the porch. And there's more than money at stake here, and you know it. Your wife's brother wrote the bank asking after the children's welfare. Wanted to know if this house was fit to raise them in. I'd say a man drowning in debt with no woman in the house to keep it, and them in order, isn't exactly the picture Boston wants to hear about. That's none of your concern. It's every bit my concern when your land's the collateral and his letters sitting on a judge's desk. Callahan straightened his hat, unhurried, cruel, in the way only calm men could be. 30 days, Whitaker. Get your house in order, truly in order, or I'll have no choice but to call the note, and your brother-in-law will have every reason in the world to take those children east where they'll be properly cared for. Good day to you. He turned his horse without waiting for an answer and rode past the wagon, past Clara, without so much as a glance her way. Clara sat frozen on the wagon bench, suitcase clutched to her chest, staring at a man she'd traveled 300 miles to work. For a man who looked in that moment less like an employer and more like someone standing at the edge of losing everything he had left in the world. Thomas turned and saw her. For a long second, neither of them said a word. Then 5 faces appeared behind him on the porch, thin, watchful, silent, in a way children shouldn't be. And Clara understood all at once that the advertisement had left out considerably more than a name. "You're the housekeeper," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, almost apologetic. "I answered an ad for a housekeeper." Clara climbed down from the wagon slowly, her eyes moving from him to the children and back again. "Nobody mentioned a family of 6. I didn't think it'd matter to you either way, so long as the work got done." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for the first time, Clara saw the exhaustion carved into his face, the kind that came from years, not nights. "I need someone to keep this house running. Cook, clean, mend, see the children fed and schooled and out of trouble." "That's not housekeeping, Mr. Whitaker. That's raising a family." "I know what it is." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and he looked away first toward the hills like he couldn't stand to hold her eyes while he said it. "I know exactly what it is, and I know I've got no right asking a stranger to do it. But I'm asking anyway because I've got nobody left to ask." Clara's hands tightened around the handle of her suitcase. She thought of Mrs. Foss's boarding house, of the coins on the table of 6 years spent caring for people who never once looked at her the way these children were looking at her now, like she might already be leaving. "I didn't come here to raise somebody else's children, Mr. Whitaker." Her voice shook despite her best effort to steady it. "I came here for honest work and a roof that wouldn't disappear from under me in a month's time." "Then you understand better than most why I need this house in order." Something flickered across his face, not quite pleading, too proud for that, but close. "You heard the man. 30 days. If this house isn't fit, if these children aren't cared for proper, I lose them. Maybe the land too. I've got nothing to offer you but wages and a warning that this won't be easy." Clara looked past him at the children again. The oldest boy stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set hard, refusing to look at her at all. A girl beside him kept her eyes on the ground. 2 younger boys shoved at each other's shoulders, restless and loud in the way boys got when nobody had told them to be still in a long while. And at the end of the row stood the smallest of them, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5, watching Clara with an expression too old for her face. "I'm sorry for your trouble, Mr. Whitaker," Clara said finally, "but I think there's been a mistake." She picked her suitcase back up. "I'll wait for the wagon to take me back to the depot." She got 3 steps before she felt its small fingers wrapping around her hand, gripping tight, refusing to let go. Clara looked down. The little girl had crossed the yard without a sound and taken hold of her as if she'd been planning it the whole time, as if letting go wasn't a thing she knew how to do anymore. "Sweetheart." Clara crouched down, gentle, careful. "What's your name?" "Emma." The girl's voice was barely more than a breath. She didn't cry. She didn't ask Clara to stay. She just held on, small fingers locked around Clara's hand like it was the only solid thing in a world that kept taking people away from her. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept sealed shut since her own mother's funeral. She looked back at Thomas, who hadn't moved, who was watching his daughter hold on to a stranger with an expression of a man who'd forgotten what hope felt like and was afraid to trust it now that it was standing in his yard. "How old is she?" Clara asked quietly. "5." Thomas's voice had gone rough. "She was 3 when her mother passed. Barely remembers her. I think that's why—" He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "She don't take to strangers, Miss Bennet. Never has. Not since." Clara looked down at Emma again, at the small hand refusing to loosen its grip, and she thought about everything the woman on the stagecoach had said, about 2 housekeepers who'd come and gone, about a banker who'd looked at this family like they were nothing more than a debt to collect. She thought about how easy it would be to walk back to that wagon and let all of it become someone else's burden. "1 month, Clara said, straightening up, but not pulling her hand free of Emma's. "I'll stay 1 month. If it doesn't work, if I can't do right by these children, I'll go and you'll have time to find someone else before that 30 days runs out." Something in Thomas's shoulders loosened just slightly, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. "Thank you," he said, and it sounded like the words cost him something to say out loud. "I know it ain't what you signed on for." "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't." She looked at the 4 other children still watching from the porch, unmoving, unconvinced. "But I don't imagine any of this is what they signed on for either. The oldest boy, Henry. She'd learn his name was. Within the hour finally spoke his voice sharp, with a bitterness that didn't belong on a 12-year-old's face. "We don't need a new mother. We had one. She's gone. Ain't nobody replacing her." "Henry." Thomas's voice carried a warning. "It's true, and you know it." Henry's eyes cut to Clara, hard and unflinching. "You'll leave just like the others. Ain't no sense pretending different." Clara held his gaze without flinching back. "I'm not here to replace anyone, Henry. I couldn't if I tried. I'm here because your father needs help keeping this family together, and it looks to me like that's something all of you want too, even if you're too angry right now to say it." Henry's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. He turned and went back inside, letting the door fall shut harder than it needed to. The girl who'd been staring at the ground finally lifted her eyes. "I'm Grace," she said softly, like she was offering something fragile. "Henry's not always like that. He's just scared." "Grace." Clara offered her a small, real smile. "Thank you for telling me." The 2 younger boys shoved forward at the same time, nearly identical, down to the dirt smudged on their cheeks. "We're Samuel and Benjamin," one of them announced. "I'm older by 4 minutes. You are not," the other shot back. "Pa said it don't matter which of us come first. It matters to me." Clara felt for the first time since stepping off that wagon something close to a laugh rising in her chest. "Well, Samuel and Benjamin, whichever of you it is, I imagine there's chores waiting, and I could use 2 strong hands to show me where the well is." They looked at each other, some silent twin negotiation passing between them, and then both took off at a run toward the side of the house, shouting over each other about who'd get there first. Thomas watched them go, then looked back at Clara with something unguarded in his face for just a moment before he caught himself and hardened it again. "You'll want to see the house," he said. "It ain't much to look at right now. I imagine it isn't." Clara looked down at Emma, who still hadn't let go of her hand. "That's all right. Houses can be put back together. It's the people inside them that matter more." She didn't know, walking through that door for the first time with a 5-year-old's hand locked in hers, just how much those 30 days would come to cost her, or how much they'd come to mean. She didn't know about the letter already sitting on a judge's desk in Boston, or the banker who intended to make good on every word of his warning, or the nights ahead that would test every ounce of patience and courage she had left in her. She only knew that somewhere between the porch and the front door, she had stopped being a stranger passing through and started becoming something this family hadn't had in a long, long time. Someone who stayed. The first morning at the Whitaker Ranch began before the sun came up. Clara heard it before she saw it, the sound of something hitting the floor in the kitchen, followed by a crash loud enough to wake the dead, followed by silence that was somehow worse than the noise. She was up and down the stairs before she'd fully opened her eyes. Samuel and Benjamin stood in the middle of the kitchen floor, a broken crock of flour between them, white dust coating their hair, their shirts, the table legs, and what appeared to be every visible surface within a 6-foot radius. They looked at her with the identical expression of two boys who had not yet decided whether to run or apologize. "We were making breakfast," Samuel said. "For you," Benjamin added quickly, "on account of you being new." "We thought it would be a kind thing," Samuel said. "It was my idea," Benjamin said. "It was not." "It was." Clara stood in the doorway in her dressing robe, flour settling like snow around her feet, and looked at these two boys, 9 years old. She'd been told twins who'd spent 2 years learning to navigate a house with no mother in it. And she made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sigh the way adults sighed when they'd already given up. She walked to the broom standing in the corner, held it out to Samuel, and said, "Which one of you sweeps and which one of you fetches water to clean that floor?" They exchanged their private twin look. "I sweep," Benjamin said. "Then you fetch," Clara told Samuel. She went to the stove and started the fire herself. "And next time you want to make breakfast, wake me first. I'll show you how to do it right, and nothing ends up on the floor." "Are you angry?" Samuel asked from the doorway, water bucket already in his hand. "I'm hungry," Clara said. "Let's fix that first and deal with the rest after." It was a small thing, barely worth mentioning in the scope of everything this house needed. But the twins talked about it at supper that evening, how she hadn't yelled, hadn't sent them away, had simply handed one of them a broom and moved forward. She didn't know it at the time, but that was the moment the twins decided she might be worth trusting. Henry did not come to breakfast that morning, or the one after. He took his biscuits from the kitchen counter, when he thought nobody was watching, ate them standing up by the barn, or not at all, and made himself scarce whenever Clara was in a room. She noticed. She didn't push. She'd learned early in life that pushing a wound that wasn't ready to be touched only made it bleed harder. But on the third morning she found him in the barn before dawn, sitting on a hay bale in the dark, not doing anything, just sitting the way boys sat when the weight of something was too heavy to carry, standing up. "Henry." He startled, then set his jaw like he was angry at himself for startling. "I'm doing chores." "Not yet, you're not." She sat down on a crate a few feet away, not close enough to crowd him, not so far it looked like she was keeping her distance. "You don't have to talk to me. I'm not asking you to. I just thought you might not want to sit alone in the dark." A long silence. Outside, one of the horses shifted and blew breath through its nose. "My mother used to come out here," Henry said finally. He didn't look at her when he said it. "When she couldn't sleep, said it was the only quiet place in the house." He paused. "I come out here sometimes too." "Sounds like something worth holding on to," Clara said. "I don't need you to tell me what's worth holding on to." "No," she agreed. "You don't." Another silence, different from the first one, a little less brittle. "She was a good mother," Henry said. His voice dropped on the last word, like the word itself was something he had to be careful with. "I believe that," Clara said. "The fact that you're out here at 5 in the morning still missing her tells me everything I need to know about what kind of woman she was." Henry turned and looked at her then, for the first time since she'd arrived. Really looked at her, like he was trying to figure out if she meant it, or if it was just the kind of thing adults said to fill up silence. He turned away again without answering. But the next morning, he was at the breakfast table when she came downstairs. He didn't say anything. He just sat down, accepted the plate she set in front of him and ate. That was Henry's version of a truce. Clara took it without comment and served everyone else. Grace was different, quieter than her silence, if that was possible. She helped without being asked, did her chores without a word of complaint, and stayed so far inside herself that for the first 2 days, Clara wasn't sure the girl had opinions about anything at all. It was the sewing that cracked it open. Clara was mending a torn hem on Benjamin's shirt, the third one she'd found in the mending basket, that was just barely holding together when Grace appeared in the doorway of the front room and stood there watching. "Can you do buttonholes?" Grace asked. Her voice was careful, like she wasn't sure the question was allowed. "I can." Clara held up the needle. "You want to learn?" Grace was across the room and seated beside her within seconds. Not eager exactly, careful the way a girl was careful when she'd taught herself not to want things too quickly in case they disappeared. "My mother was going to show me," Grace said, threading her own needle with a steadiness that surprised Clara. "She promised she would, and then she got sick and—" She stopped. She never got the chance. Clara set her own work down. "Then let's make sure she gets it now," she said. "Your mother made a promise. We're just going to finish keeping it for her." Grace looked up and something in her face shifted, not happiness exactly, but the beginning of the space where happiness could grow if someone gave it enough room. They sat together every evening after supper, after that needle and thread, Grace learning the things her mother had promised to teach her. Grace never said thank you out loud. She showed it instead the way she started saving Clara the chair closest to the lamp, without being asked the way she brought her tea. She hadn't asked for the way she started sleeping with her door cracked open instead of shut tight. Emma barely left Clara's side at all. She followed her from room to room, sat at her feet while she cooked, appeared at her elbow, when she was sweeping, materialized out of nowhere every time Clara sat down. She rarely spoke. She seemed to prefer just being near the way young animals stayed close to the warmth of whatever they'd decided was safe. On the fourth night, Clara was sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, about to stand and blow out the lamp, when the girl grabbed her hand. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" Emma asked. The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. "Yes," Clara said. "I'll still be here tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after." Emma studied her face for a long moment, serious as a judge. "The other lady left on a Tuesday," she said. "She didn't even say goodbye." "I'm not the other lady," Clara said. Emma seemed to weigh that. Then she released Clara's hand, turned over, and was asleep in minutes. Clara sat beside her in the dark a little longer than she needed to, listening to the child breathe, and tried not to think about what kind of world made a 5-year-old need to ask the adults around her to promise they'd still be present in the morning. Thomas Whitaker was harder to read than any of them. He was up before dawn and usually not back until well after supper, and when he was in the house, he moved through it like a man who had learned not to take up too much space. He thanked her for meals in 2 or 3 words, answered her questions about the household directly, and without excess, and never once asked her anything personal. But she noticed things. The way he lingered in the doorway of a room she was in, as if he'd come to say something and then changed his mind. The way he fixed the hinge on the kitchen cabinet she'd been wrestling with all week, without her asking him to. She came downstairs one morning, and it simply worked. The way he looked at his children, when he thought nobody was watching him with a grief so tender, it barely had room to breathe, like a man watching people he loved. From behind glass, he didn't know how to break through. On the 6th evening, she was still in the kitchen, well after the children were in bed, scrubbing the bottom of a pot that had been neglected long enough to qualify as a geological formation when Thomas came in through the back door. He stopped when he saw her still at it. "You ought to be in bed," he said. "So ought you," she replied without looking up. A pause. He crossed to the water basin and washed the day off his hands in silence. She could feel him thinking something he wasn't saying, the way you could feel weather changing before it arrived. "You're doing well with them," he said finally, his back still to her. "The children. They're different than they were." "They're good children," she said. They just needed someone to show up consistently. Yeah. He was quiet again. Then, Miss Bennet, I want you to know that what Callahan said about the children being sent east, I won't let that happen. Whatever else, I won't let that happen. Clara set the pot down and looked at him. How much time do we actually have? He turned around then, and she saw it not the hard exterior he showed the world and the banker on horseback, but what lived underneath it. The exhaustion, the fear, the particular terror of a man watching everything he loves start to slip and not knowing which hand to use to hold on. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe less, depending on what Callahan puts in that letter to Boston. My wife's brother Richard. He never thought much of this life out here. Never thought much of me, if I'm honest. He'd love nothing better than to take those children back east and raise them proper, as he'd call it. And never mind that they've got no memory of the East and everything they love is on this land. Has he ever met them? Clara asked. Since your wife passed. He came out once, 3 months after. Took one look at the state of this house and wrote my wife's parents a letter calling it unfit. Thomas's jaw tightened. By then, I'd already lost my housekeeper, first one, the one who came before you. I had no one. I was doing everything myself and doing all of it badly, and the house looked exactly like what it was, a place a man was running alone with 5 children and nowhere near enough hours in the day. And now? Clara asked. He looked at her steadily. Now it's starting to look like a home again. A pause that carried more weight than the words on either side of it. I owe you more than wages for that, Miss Bennet. You owe me exactly wages, she said. That's what we agreed. Something almost like a smile crossed his face there, and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Good night, Miss Bennet. Good night, Mr. Whitaker. He went up the stairs, and Clara stood in the clean kitchen for a moment, listening to the silence of a house where 5 children were sleeping soundly, and thought about how 30 days had seemed like barely enough time when she'd agreed to stay, and how now she wasn't sure they'd be anywhere close to enough. The second week brought a different kind of test. 3 women from town arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, just as Clara was getting the twins started on their lessons at the kitchen table. The woman who knocked was named Margaret Alcott, the wife of the general store owner, and she had the particular face of someone who'd come to make an observation and already decided what they were going to observe before they'd left the house. We heard Thomas had taken on a new housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott said, looking Clara over with the careful thoroughness of someone pricing livestock. We wanted to check in, make sure everything was in order. That's very kind of you, Clara said. The children are in the middle of lessons, but you're welcome to come sit a spell. She served them coffee. She listened to them talk about the town, about the weather, about Margaret Alcott's garden. She watched them look at the house, the swept floors, the mended curtains, the children sitting quiet and obedient at the table, and recalibrate whatever expectations they'd come in with. I'll say it's cleaner than it was, one of the other women murmured half to herself. It looks very different. Mrs. Alcott allowed her tone a shade more careful than before. How are you finding the children? Wonderful, Clara said, and she meant it. Grace is learning to sew. Samuel and Benjamin are further ahead in their reading than they probably know. Henry works harder than any boy his age I've ever seen, and Emma. She glanced at the little girl sitting quietly beside the window, drawing something in a notebook, is just about the most determined small person I've ever come across. The women exchanged a look. One of them leaned slightly forward. We've heard there was some trouble with Mr. Callahan and the bank. That's Mr. Whitaker's business, Clara said pleasantly. Not mine to discuss. Mrs. Alcott set her coffee cup down with the deliberateness of a woman who had something to say and intended to say it in her own time. Miss Bennet, I'll be plain with you. I don't know exactly what arrangement you and Thomas Whitaker have made, but I want you to understand that in a town this size people notice things. People talk. And a young unmarried woman living in a widower's house is doing exactly the job she was hired to do, Clara said. Her voice was perfectly even. I can assure you, Mrs. Alcott, that everything in this house is entirely proper. I didn't say it wasn't. You implied it. She met the woman's eyes calmly. I've traveled 300 miles to take an honest position and help 5 children who've been through more in 2 years than most adults face in a lifetime. I respect your concern for the family. I'm just not sure the concern is entirely for the family. Silence fell over this kitchen like a curtain. The twins had stopped even pretending to do their lessons and were watching with the fixed attention of 2 small boys who understood that something interesting was happening. Mrs. Alcott stood, smoothed her skirt, and gave Clara a look that was half offended and half something more reluctant, the look of a woman who'd expected to have the upper hand and found it missing. Good day, Miss Bennet. Good day, Mrs. Alcott. Thank you for coming. They left. Clara poured herself more coffee, sat back down at the table, and looked at the twins. Eyes on your readers, she said. They dove back to their books so fast they nearly knocked them off the table. That evening, Thomas heard the story second-hand through Henry, who'd been within earshot of the kitchen window while splitting wood outside and heard every word. He came to find Clara after supper, and there was something different in his face when he looked at her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. Alcott's wife has a long memory and a longer tongue. She could make things difficult. She could try, Clara said. Mrs. Alcott came here looking to find something wrong and leave with a story. I didn't give her one. Whatever she does with that is her business. Thomas studied her for a moment, the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, like he was trying to solve a question he hadn't quite decided to ask yet. Where did you learn to handle people like that? 6 years of caring for other people's business, she said. You learn quickly that the loudest people in the room are usually the most afraid of being ignored. He laughed, a short surprise sound, like it had come out before he'd thought to stop it. He caught himself, pressed his mouth together, but the laugh had already happened. Clara filed it away without mentioning it, the way you filed away the first robin of spring, small but proof of something. The 10-day mark hit harder than Clara expected. She'd thought she was managing. She'd thought she had her footing. But that Wednesday morning, she woke before dawn to Emma crying in the room next door. Not the crying of a child with a nightmare, but the specific, low-sustained crying of a small person who'd been awake for hours and had simply run out of ways to keep it inside. Clara went in without hesitating. Emma was sitting up in bed, tear-streaked and exhausted, clutching a small cloth rabbit that had been mended so many times across its seams, it looked like it had survived a war. She made it, Emma said without preamble, holding the rabbit up. Mama made it for me, the ears coming loose again. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, took the rabbit, gently examined the ear. 1 stitch had come free. An easy fix, but not at 5 in the morning in the dark. And not when the real problem wasn't the ear at all. Do you want to tell me about her? Clara asked. Your mama. Emma wiped her nose with the back of her hand. Henry says she smelled like lavender. That's a good thing to remember. I don't remember it. Emma's face crumpled for a moment, then steadied in the way very young children steadied themselves when they'd been practicing it long enough that the muscle had developed. I try and I can't remember what she smelled like. I can't remember her voice. I only know her face because Papa has the picture on the mantel. Clara reached over and took Emma's small hand. The things you remember don't have to be the things everyone else remembers. What do you remember? A pause. Her hands, Emma said finally. They were warm. Even in winter, they were always warm. That's everything, Clara said. A little girl knowing her mother's hands were warm, that's exactly what a mama would want to be remembered for. Emma leaned her head against Clara's arm and didn't say anything else for a while. Clara sat with her in the dark and thought about her own mother, about the specific warmth of particular hands, and about how the children in this house had been carrying grief too big for their size without anyone sitting with them inside it. Clara, Emma said quietly. It was the first time she'd used her name without the formal Miss attached to it. Clara felt it land in her chest like something had shifted. Yes. Are you going to go away? Not tonight, Clara said. But eventually. She could have deflected it, could have said something soft and non-committal that let them both off the hook. Instead, she held the question for a moment honestly and said what she actually meant. I don't know what the future looks like, Emma. I can't promise you forever, but I can promise you that as long as I'm here all the way. Not halfway, not with one foot out the door, all the way. And I promise you'll always know ahead of time you'll never wake up and find me gone without a word. Emma thought about that seriously, the way she thought about everything. Then she nodded once, as if they'd settled a legal agreement, and lay back down. Clara sat with her until she fell asleep, then carried the rabbit downstairs and found the needle and thread by lamplight and stitched the ear back on so firmly it would outlast the century. She was still at the table when Thomas came down in the dark before his own dawn start, and he stopped when he saw her. His eyes went to the rabbit in her hands. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Her mother made that for her, he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. I know. Emma told me. Clara set the rabbit on the table, the ear held firm. It'll hold now. Thomas looked at the rabbit, and something moved across his face so fast she almost missed it. Grief and gratitude, and something else, something he wasn't ready to name yet. All folding together in the brief, unguarded moment before he caught himself and turned toward the coffee pot. You didn't have to do that, he said. For the second time that week. Emma needed it done, she said, for no particular second time. Thomas poured his coffee, stood there with the cup in both hands, not drinking it, just standing. She hasn't cried for her mother in months, he said. Not where I could see anyway. She doesn't want to upset me. She's 5 years old and she's trying to protect me. His voice went very quiet on the last sentence. What kind of world makes a 5-year-old think she has to protect her father from grief? Clara didn't answer that because it wasn't a question that wanted an answer. It wanted to be heard, and she let it be. The 14-day mark arrived with a letter. Thomas brought it in from the post on a Saturday afternoon, and the way he set it on the table without opening it told Clara everything she needed to know about who it was from. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at the envelope with the expression of a man looking at a thing he was going to have to deal with whether he was ready or not. Richard, she asked. He nodded. Read it, she said. He opened it slowly, the way you opened something you expected to hurt, and read it standing up. His face didn't change much as he read, but his hands went still. When he lowered the letter, he was quiet for a moment that stretched several beats too long. He's coming, Thomas said. Clara's stomach dropped. When? 3 weeks. He says he has reason to believe the children's welfare is at risk, and he intends to assess the situation firsthand before determining whether legal action is warranted. Thomas set the letter down with a care that was somehow more alarming than if he'd thrown it. Callahan's been writing to him. Has to be. The timing's not coincidence. What does legal action mean for the children? It means a judge in Boston decides whether they're better off on this ranch or in his house back east. Thomas's voice stayed flat and controlled the way voices went flat when the alternative was coming apart. Richard's got money. He's got position. And on paper right now, I've got a mortgaged ranch 3 weeks left on a banknote, and a household that any outside eye could argue is barely held together. It's not barely held together, Clara said, sharper than she intended. These children are doing lessons. They're eating proper meals. They're sleeping and laughing, and I know that. He looked at her. You know that. But Richard's going to walk in here and look for reasons, and a man with a lawyer on retainer and a grudge against the way his sister was living when she died is going to find reasons whether they exist or not. Clara pressed her hands flat on the kitchen table. She thought about Emma asking if she'd be here tomorrow. She thought about Henry at the breakfast table, jaw still set, but showing up. She thought about Grace learning buttonholes about the twins and the flour on the floor, about a cloth rabbit with a mended ear, about 5 children who'd spent 2 years in a house full of grief, and were only now beginning to remember how to just be children. She thought about Thomas, standing at the edge of the porch that first afternoon, looking at her with a face that had forgotten how to ask for things, saying, I've got nobody left to ask. And she thought about the fact that 3 weeks from now, someone from Boston was going to walk into this house and decide whether all of it was enough. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. Clara straightened up. Her jaw was set. Then let's make sure he walks into something he can't argue with. Something shifted in Thomas's face. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But the place just before hope, where a person starts to believe a thing might be possible again. He nodded once. All right, he said. That night at supper, the children were louder than they'd been since Clara arrived. Samuel tried to teach the table a card trick he'd learned from the stable hand and dropped half the deck on the floor. Benjamin crawled under the table to retrieve them and refused to come back out until Grace threatened to eat his biscuit. Emma fell asleep with her face almost in her plate and had to be carried upstairs by Thomas, who came back down looking softer around the edges than usual. Henry, sitting at the far end of the table, watched his father come back in from the stairs and said without fanfare, "She's getting better." "Yeah," Thomas said, sitting down. "She is." "On account of Miss Clara." Thomas looked at his oldest son across the table. Henry's face was still set in its habitual guardedness, but there was something underneath it now, a grudging, careful acknowledgement, the kind that cost a proud 12-year-old something to give. "I know," Thomas said quietly. Henry picked up his fork. "I still don't need a new mother," he said. "Just so that's clear." "It's clear," Thomas said. A pause. "She makes good biscuits, though," Henry added. And Thomas laughed, a real one this time, full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that had been sitting in storage for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to come back out. Samuel shot up from under the table at the sound of it, cards scattered everywhere, and stared at his father like he'd heard something he wasn't sure he recognized. "What's funny?" Samuel demanded. "Nothing." Thomas was still smiling, helpless against it. "Everything. Eat your supper." Clara listened to all of it from the kitchen doorway, where she'd gone to refill the water pitcher, and she stood there longer than she needed to, just listening. Just letting the sound of this house, which had been so quiet when she'd arrived, so hollowed out by loss, fill up around her like something real and irreplaceable. She thought about the letter on the table. She thought about Richard and Boston and lawyers and 30 days and what it meant to fight for something you hadn't planned on caring about. Then she went back in, refilled everyone's glass, and sat down at the table with them in the place that had somehow, without her planning, it started to feel like hers. The 3 weeks after Thomas read Richard's letter were the most purposeful of Clara's life. She didn't announce a plan. She didn't sit Thomas down and draw out a strategy on paper. She simply moved through the house each morning with the quiet certainty of a woman who understood exactly what was at stake and had decided somewhere between setting the rabbit on the table and walking back into that supper room that she was not going to let these children lose another thing they loved. The lessons became structured. Real structured reading, arithmetic, penmanship, geography. She set a proper schedule and held to it the way you held to a fence post in a windstorm, not because the children resisted, but because structure itself was the point. A house where children had lessons at the same hour every day, where meals appeared on the table at the same time every evening, where chores were assigned and completed and checked. That was a house a visiting uncle from Boston would have trouble calling unfit. Henry was the one who saw it first. He cornered her alone in the front room on a Thursday afternoon, book in hand, voice low so his siblings couldn't hear from the kitchen. "You're getting the house ready for him, aren't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Clara said, because Henry deserved the truth, and she'd learned that quickly enough. His jaw worked. "What happens if he doesn't think it's good enough?" "Then we make sure it is," she said. "And if we can't, if he takes them anyway." Something raw moved through his voice on the last word, the specific fear of a 12-year-old boy who'd already lost the one thing he'd been sure of. "They'd take me too. I'm a minor. I go where the little ones go." "I know." "So what do we do?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. This boy with his mother's grief still sitting in his eyes, and his father's stubbornness in every line of his face, and she said the most honest thing she had. "We make this house look exactly like what it actually is, Henry. A home. and we trust that anyone with eyes can see the difference between a home and a house that isn't one." He stared at her. Then he turned and went back to the kitchen. She heard him tell the twins in a voice that brooked absolutely no argument that they were going to sweep the front porch before supper, and they were going to do it right. Clara stood in the front room and let herself breathe for exactly 5 seconds. Then she went back to work. Thomas noticed the shift. He started coming in earlier from the fields, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but by half an hour each evening, then an hour drawn in by something he probably couldn't have named. He appeared at the supper table before the food was on it. He started asking the children about their lessons, not in the vague, distracted way of a man performing fatherhood, but with actual questions, remembering what Grace had said the night before, following up with Samuel on the arithmetic problem that had stumped him. It was on one of those evenings, a week before Richard was due to arrive, that Clara came into the front room and found Thomas sitting with Emma in the chair by the window, reading to her from a book of illustrated fables. Emma curled against his side so thoroughly she'd practically become part of the furniture. He was doing the voices. Different voices for different characters, including one so ridiculous that Emma had a fist in her mouth trying to contain her laughter. Clara stood in the doorway and didn't make a sound. She just looked at this man who had spent 2 years burying himself in work because he didn't know how else to hold his grief, rediscovering the fact that he had something to offer his children beyond the income that kept a roof over their heads. He looked up and saw her watching. The ridiculous voice died. Some color came into his face. "She asked me to read," he said. "I can see that," Clara said. "Don't let me interrupt." She went back to the kitchen. But she was smiling when she got there. 6 days before Richard arrived, Callahan came back. He didn't come to the house this time. He came to the feed store in town, where Thomas had gone early to settle an account, and he came with a man Clara had never seen a younger man in a good coat who stood a step behind Callahan and kept his hands in his pockets, with the particular stillness of someone paid to observe and report. Thomas told her about it that evening. After the children were in bed, his voice stripped of everything except the bare facts, because that was how he handled things that frightened him. "Callahan was there with a man I've never seen in Larkspur before," Thomas said. "Didn't introduce him, just watched me the whole time I settled my account. When I was leaving, Callahan said, and I want you to understand, he said this in front of 3 other men. He said, 'I'd hate to see what Richard Howard thinks when he arrives and finds a woman in your house under these circumstances.'" Clara went very still. He said that deliberately. He's been writing to Richard, feeding him things. Maybe not lies, maybe just the parts of the truth that look worst on their own. Thomas exhaled slowly. He doesn't just want the land, Clara. He wants me to give up. He's been at this long enough that he knows he can't force me out directly, so he's going to use Richard. Use the children. He's going to tell Richard what he wants him to hear, Clara said. And Richard's going to arrive here already convinced. He looked at her. And then he's going to look at you, and he's going to use you too. The fact that you're here. The fact that you're... He stopped himself, jaw tight. "That I'm an unmarried woman living in a widower's house," Clara finished because there was no point in leaving it unsaid. "Yes." He held her gaze, and it cost him something she could see that. "I should have thought more carefully about how it would look. I was desperate, and I wasn't thinking about your reputation." "My reputation," Clara said flatly, "has been at the mercy of every employer I've ever had for 6 years. I'm not afraid of what it looks like, Mr. Whitaker. I'm afraid of what happens to those children if we lose." Something shifted in his face. He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he was working up to say seemed to travel a great distance before it reached his mouth. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to understand that I'm asking it for practical reasons and not because I'm the kind of man who—" He stopped again, and it was almost painful to watch a man so accustomed to plain speech stumble over himself. "The children are all that matter here. Protecting them is all that matters." "I know," she said. "Ask, would you consider staying permanently?" He said it fast, the way you ripped off a bandage. "Not as my housekeeper, as my wife." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him carefully. "Thomas, I know what I'm asking. I know it isn't. He dragged a hand through his hair. I know it's not the proposal a woman deserves. I know I'm asking you to take on 5 children and a mortgaged ranch and a man who doesn't have the first idea how to be anything but tired anymore. I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I'm asking you to give this family a fighting chance. And what happens, she said slowly, when Richard arrives and sees that we've married in the 2 weeks between his letter and his visit, he'll think it's exactly what it is, a desperate arrangement. Then we give him no reason to think that. Thomas. She waited until he met her eyes. I'm not going to marry you to save your house. He looked away. Right. I'm not finished. She waited again. I would consider staying. I would consider what you're asking, but not as a strategy, not as a legal maneuver. If I stay because I've decided this is where I belong. That's the only version of this I'm able to agree to. He turned back to her. His face was still guarded, still carefully composed, but his eyes were doing something different, something more than gratitude, more than relief, something neither of them had the language for yet. Do you, he said, belong here? It was the most direct thing he'd asked her since she'd arrived. Clara thought about Emma's hand in hers on the day she'd almost left. She thought about Henry at the breakfast table, showing up without explanation, because that was his version of telling her she mattered. She thought about Grace learning buttonholes about the twins, and their maddening, generous, exhausting chaos about a cloth rabbit with a mended ear, about Thomas reading ridiculous voices to a small girl curled against his side. I think I might, she said quietly. He nodded, once. Slowly, like a man being careful not to reach for something before he was sure it was real. Then I'll wait, he said, for you to be certain. That's all I'm asking, she said. He said goodnight and went upstairs. Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, in a house that was beginning to feel less like someone else's, and more like something she'd been unknowingly traveling toward for years. Richard Howard arrived on a Tuesday. He was Thomas's wife's older brother, and Clara recognized him before Thomas introduced him because he had the particular bearing of a man who considered judgment a civic duty. He was well-dressed, precise, not unkind in the obvious way, and somehow that made it worse. An openly cruel man was easy to oppose. A man who genuinely believed he was right, who genuinely thought he was protecting these children, who had actual grief in his eyes when he looked at the family portraits on the wall. That man was something else entirely. He shook Clara's hand when Thomas introduced her, held it a beat longer than necessary while he assessed her face, and then he said, Miss Bennet, you're the housekeeper. Yes, she said. And you're the uncle who's come to decide whether the children are all right. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He hadn't expected her to name it directly. Yes, he said. That's right. They're at lessons, Clara said. I'll let Thomas show you to the front room. I'll have coffee ready in 10 minutes. She went to the kitchen. She didn't rush. She made the coffee with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, because rushing was what you did when you were afraid. And she had decided somewhere between last night and this morning that she wasn't going to be afraid of Richard Howard. She was going to let this house speak for itself. The first hour was polite. Richard sat in the front room with Thomas, and she could hear the low murmur of their voices without making out the words. Careful, measured the conversation of 2 men who'd never gotten along, trying to find the shape of a reason to cooperate. She brought coffee. She brought the children in to say hello when their lessons finished one at a time, the way they came naturally, not lined up and presented like evidence. Grace came first with her quiet dignity, and the sewing she'd been working on tucked under her arm. She shook her uncle's hand and answered his questions about school in full sentences without being prompted. The twins arrived together as they always did, interrupted each other twice, and made Richard laugh genuinely, involuntarily, when Benjamin tried to explain a card trick, and Samuel corrected every other word, until Benjamin threw up both hands and told him to do it himself if he thought he was so much smarter. Henry came last. He stood in the doorway, shook his uncle's hand exactly once, looked him in the eye and said, I remember you visiting, after Mama died. You said this house wasn't fit." The room went so quiet, Clara could hear the fire settle. Richard cleared his throat. "I was concerned. It's fit now," Henry said. Not aggressive, not defiant, just stating a fact clean and flat and irrefutable. "Miss Clara made it fit. I thought you should know that before you decide anything." He left without waiting for a response. Richard looked at the doorway Henry had walked through, then at Thomas, then at Clara, where she stood near the kitchen door. "That boy," he said slowly, "is exactly like his mother." It was the first thing Richard had said that Thomas visibly didn't know how to answer. He sat for a moment with his hands on his knees and looked at his brother-in-law with an expression that had lost its defensive edge. "I know," Thomas said. The real moment came after supper. The children were in bed. Thomas had stepped out to check on the horses. Richard sat at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking, and Clara sat across from him and waited because she'd understood from the moment he'd arrived that this conversation was coming, and there was no point in trying to get ahead of it. "Callahan wrote me 4 letters, Richard said without preamble. "I know," Clara said. "He says you've been here 6 weeks, and the situation is—" He paused, chose his word carefully, irregular. "He means an unmarried woman in a widower's house." "Yes. Mr. Howard." Clara set her coffee down. "I came here to take an honest position. I've taken it honestly. Every person in Larkspur who's come through that door has found exactly what you found today, a clean house, children, who are fed and schooled and sleeping soundly. If Mr. Callahan has found something improper in that, I'd be curious to know what it is." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "He says Thomas is in over his head financially, and the children would be better provided for in Boston. Better provided for financially, maybe," Clara said carefully. "But Henry is 12 years old, and he knows every inch of this land. Grace is 10, and she's been drawing maps of the creek trails from memory since she was 8, according to her father. These children don't know Boston. They know this. You take them east, you don't rescue them from hardship. You take them from the only home they have left." Something moved in Richard's face. He looked down at his coffee cup. "My sister loved this place," he said, quieter now. "I never understood why. I thought it was too hard, too isolated, too far from everything that made life comfortable." A pause. "I still think that." "But," Clara said. He looked up. "She was happy here. Genuinely happy in a way she wasn't back east. And those children—" He stopped, steadied himself. "Those children look like her, especially the girl. Grace has Margaret's eyes exactly." The room was still. "Mr. Howard," Clara said gently, "what is it you actually came here to see?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I came to see whether my sister's children were all right." And he looked at her with the expression of a man who'd arrived with a verdict already written and found the evidence didn't match it. "They appear," he said slowly, "to be more than all right." Clara nodded, said nothing, let it sit. Richard turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Callahan told me Thomas was failing them. Callahan wants the land," Clara said. "He's been working toward it for months. He found your letter on a judge's desk, or he put it there and he used it. He used your grief for your sister and your concern for the children as a tool to destabilize this household." She kept her voice even. "That's what happened, Mr. Howard. I can't prove all of it, but you're a man who knows business, and I imagine you can see the shape of it." Richard sat very still. His face had gone through several things in quick succession: surprise, resistance, something calculating, and then finally, something that looked like the grim recognition of a man whose distaste for Thomas Whitaker had made him easier to use than he'd like to admit. The back door opened and Thomas came in, stopped when he read the silence in the room. Richard looked up at his brother-in-law. "Sit down, Thomas," he said. "I think we need to talk about Callahan." Thomas looked at Clara for a half-second. "Not for permission, but the way you looked at someone when you needed to know if the ground was steady before you put your weight on it." She gave the smallest nod. He sat down. They talked until midnight. Clara excused herself at 11, because some of what needed to be said between these two men needed to be said without her in the room. And she was wise enough to know which battles she belonged in and which ones she needed to get out of the way of. She went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and listened to the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. Two men who had circled each other in grief and blame for 2 years, finally trying to find something other than an opponent on the other side of the table. She didn't know what they decided that night. She fell asleep before they finished. What she knew in the morning was this: Richard's horse was still in the barn. He was still at the breakfast table when she came down, eating biscuits with the twins on either side of him, listening with an expression of dazed bewilderment, while they argued simultaneously about something involving a frog and a tin bucket and a sequence of events that had apparently happened in the barn the previous summer. "And then it jumped," Samuel said. "Not right away," Benjamin corrected. "It sat there for a minute first." "It sat there for 3 seconds. That's not a minute." "It felt like a minute." "A lot of things feel like a minute, Benjamin, that doesn't." "Enough," Clara said, setting the coffee down, and both of them went quiet, with the reflexive compliance of two boys who'd learned which particular tone of voice meant business. Richard watched all of this with something close to wonder. Then he looked at Thomas across the table. "Does it always run like this?" "Pretty much," Thomas said. Richard looked down at his coffee. "Margaret would have been good at this," he said softly. "She was always better at noise than I was." "She was," Thomas agreed. And the two of them sat for a moment in the same grief, which was the first time Clara suspected that they'd ever done that, without it turning into blame. Emma arrived at the kitchen doorway in her nightgown rabbit under her arm, and looked at her uncle with the direct, unsentimental assessment of a 5-year-old who had decided to form her own opinion. "Are you staying?" she asked him. Richard blinked. "For a day or two, I think." Emma considered this. "All right." She climbed into the chair beside Clara, put the rabbit on the table, and picked up a biscuit. "Don't feed the frog," she told her uncle. "He's Benjamin's responsibility. If you feed him, Benjamin forgets, and then he doesn't get fed twice." Benjamin looked righteously indignant. Samuel looked like he'd been vindicated about something. Richard looked at Clara over Emma's head with an expression that was half helpless and entirely human. "Callahan never mentioned the frog," he said. "No," Clara said. "I imagine he didn't." The storm came on the second night of Richard's visit, and it came fast, the way storms came in Montana, when they'd been building all day, and there was nothing between you and the plains to slow them down. By the time Thomas rode out to check on the cattle in the north pasture, the sky had already gone the particular green-black that meant serious trouble, and Clara stood on the porch, watching him go with the children gathered around her, knowing she'd told him to wait, knowing he'd gone anyway, because that was what he did. He went toward the thing that needed tending every time, even when the cost was his own safety. She put the children to bed before the worst of it hit. Henry asked to stay up. She told him no, with a firmness that left no room for argument, and when he went upstairs without pushing back, she understood that even Henry, in some deep and unspoken part of himself, needed to be treated like a child. Sometimes needed someone to tell him he didn't have to be responsible for everything tonight. Richard sat in the front room with her, not talking, just sitting the way you sat with someone when the waiting was too heavy to carry alone. At midnight, he said, "He goes out in this kind of weather because he can't stand the thought of losing another part of what he loves." "I know," Clara said. Margaret said that about him once, that he'd run himself into the ground for the things he loved. He paused. She wasn't wrong. "She wasn't," Clara said. The back door crashed open at midnight, and Thomas came through it the way a man came through a door when something had gone wrong, fast off balance, the cold and the wet, and the evidence of the fall already written in the way he was holding his arm. Clara was on her feet before he'd finished coming through the door. Richard was right behind her. Thomas's face was gray under the dirt and the cold, and there was blood at his hairline where something had caught him, and he was holding his right arm against his chest with the careful deliberateness of a man who knew exactly how badly it was hurt and was trying not to think too directly about it. "Horse went down on the north trail," he said before either of them could ask. Rock shelf. She's all right, I got her up. But He stopped. Something shifted in his face, the hard composure he'd worn all evening cracking just slightly at the edges. I think my arm's broke. Sit down, Clara said. Not a request. He sat. Richard went for more light while Clara got the medical kit from the cabinet, the kit she'd reorganized in her first week because it had been in genuine disarray. No order to it, like everything else had been when she arrived. She worked quickly and carefully, checking the wound at his hairline first, because head wounds bled in a way that made them look worse than they were, and this one was no exception, deep enough to need cleaning, not deep enough to be dangerous. Thomas sat absolutely still while she worked, which told her he was in more pain than his face was admitting. Thomas, she said quietly while Richard was still out of the room. I need you to let go of the arm. He was still holding it pressed to his chest, the way you kept a broken thing held together by sheer will. I need to see it. I know. He didn't move. I know it hurts, she said. You can still let go. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man doing something that required more than physical effort, he let his arm drop to the table. She checked it carefully. Broken. Yes, the radius lower down, and badly enough that it needed setting and splinting, and would need proper doctoring in the morning. But not the kind of break that threatened anything beyond months of frustrating limitation and a ranch hand carrying more of the work than he'd want. She splinted it with what she had. Thomas watched her work with an expression that had given up on composure, entirely too tired, too cold, too much pain for the armor to hold. He looked like what he was, a man who had been running on will and grief and determination for 2 years and had just run out of ground to run on. The cattle, she said. Move to the lower pasture before it hit. They're all right. He exhaled. Everything's all right. Richard came back in, sat down. The extra lamp. Looked at his brother-in-law with something that had shifted considerably since dinner. You could have waited, he said. Could have. Thomas agreed. But you didn't. No. Thomas looked at him levelly. Margaret knew when she married me that this was the life. I've never pretended to be something I'm not, Richard. Not to her, not to those children, and not to you. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, and the three of them were at the kitchen table in the middle of the night, while the storm raged outside, and something in the room had changed from what it had been before Thomas came through that door. I'm going to write to the bank, Richard said finally. I have money enough to settle the note. Consider it a loan long-term's fair interest. You pay me back when the ranch can afford it. Thomas went very still. Richard? Don't make it into something large, Richard said with the particular clipped tone of a man who was uncomfortable with sentiment and had arrived at a generous act from a practical direction. My sister loved this land. Her children are on it. Callahan doesn't deserve to profit from any of that. He paused. And I was wrong to let him use my grief as leverage. I should have come sooner and looked for myself instead of listening to letters. Thomas looked at his brother-in-law across the table with the kind of expression that didn't have a word for it, the particular face of a man who'd braced for impact so long that the absence of it left him temporarily without bearings. Thank you, he said, just that. But he said it like it meant something too large for 2 words to carry, and Richard nodded like he understood that, and then both of them looked away from each other in the way men did when they'd arrived somewhere honest and needed a moment to adjust. Clara bandaged the last of Thomas's arm, tied the splint, and set his coffee back in front of him. Drink that, she said. You're going into shock from the cold. He drank it. Richard looked at Clara across the table, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there when he'd arrived 2 days ago, not quite apology, but close. The acknowledgement of a man who'd come with a verdict and found something he hadn't expected instead. My sister would have liked you, he said. Clara looked at him steadily. I hope so, she said. I think I would have liked her. The storm broke somewhere near 3 in the morning, the way Montana storms always did, fast without ceremony, like something large had simply decided it was finished and moved on. Thomas was asleep in the chair by then, splinted arm across his chest, and Clara and Richard had long since stopped talking, sitting in the particular companionable quiet of two people who'd arrived at an understanding. Clara looked at him sleeping there, this man who went out into storms because he couldn't stand the thought of losing another thing he loved, and she thought about what he'd asked her in the kitchen about belonging, about staying. She thought she had her answer. She just hadn't told him yet. Richard Howard left on a Thursday morning 3 days after the storm. He shook Thomas's good hand on the porch, his left hand gripping Thomas's shoulder in the brief, gruff way men of his generation expressed things they couldn't say out loud. He kissed Grace on the forehead. He let the twins shake his hand simultaneously, which meant both of them grabbed it at once and nearly pulled him off balance, and he laughed the same involuntary laugh they'd gotten out of him at the supper table, and said something under his breath that sounded like "Lord help this household." When he got to Henry, he stopped. Henry stood straight, arms at his sides, chin level, and Richard looked at him for a long moment, the way you looked at something that reminded you of someone you'd loved and lost. "You take care of your father," Richard said. "I always have," Henry said. Richard nodded once, turned away, before either of them could see what that cost him, and climbed into the wagon that would take him back to the depot. He found Clara last. She was standing at the edge of the porch with Emma's hand in hers, and he stopped in front of her and seemed to weigh something. "I'll write to the bank today," he said. "The note will be settled before the end of the month. Callahan won't have anything left to use." "Thank you, Mr. Howard." He looked at her one long, careful look, the kind a man gave when he was trying to fix something in his memory. "My sister chose well when she chose this life," he said. "I didn't understand that before." A pause. "I think she'd say the same thing about you." Clara felt it land in her chest and didn't trust herself to answer immediately. She pressed Emma's hand instead gently and said, "Safe travels, Mr. Howard." He tipped his hat, walked to the wagon, and didn't look back. He was the kind of man who didn't let himself look back. Clara understood that. She'd spent 6 years among people who didn't let themselves look back at the things they'd left. The wagon rounded the bend in the trail and disappeared. Thomas came to stand beside her on the porch. They watched the empty road for a moment in the particular silence of two people who'd just come through something difficult together and were still finding their feet on the other side. "He meant what he said," Thomas said, "about the note." "I know he did. That changes things." He said it quietly, carefully, like a man walking out onto ice he wasn't entirely sure would hold. "The immediate threat, the deadline, Callahan's leverage that's going to be gone within the week." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Which means you don't have to stay for the same reasons you might have needed to stay before." Clara looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the road where the wagon had gone. Hands in his jacket pockets, jaw set in that way he had when he was saying something that cost him. "Thomas," she said, "I want you to know that." He turned then and met her eyes, and whatever careful distance he'd been maintaining since the night he'd asked her to stay seemed to have burned off entirely, like morning frost under noon sun. "I want you to know that nothing you decide from here is about the bank, or Richard, or Callahan, or any of the rest of it. Whatever you decide, it's yours to decide free and clear." Emma tugged on Clara's hand, looked up at her with a 5-year-old's uncanny ability to read the temperature of a room without understanding the words. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked. "No," Clara said, and she looked at Thomas when she said it. "I'm not going anywhere." Something shifted in his face, quick and unguarded there, and gone before he locked it back up. But she'd seen it. The relief was so deep it almost looked like pain. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed. They went back inside, and the day resumed, and nothing between them was said differently than it had been before. But everything was different. The way everything in a room is different after you've finally opened a window that's been stuck shut all winter. The week that followed was the strangest Clara had known at the ranch. Strange because it was good. Quietly, unremarkably, sustainably good, the kind of good that didn't announce itself, that just settled into the bones of the house and stayed there. Thomas's arm was healing. The doctor from town had come the morning after the storm, confirmed the break, re-splinted it properly, and told him in the direct manner of a man who'd patched up too many stubborn ranchers to sugarcoat anything that he was to do nothing strenuous for 6 weeks, or he'd be dealing with a crooked bone for the rest of his life. Thomas lasted 4 days before he was back in the yard, one-handed, directing the hands on the fencing work he'd had to let sit because his version of rest was doing things slightly less dangerous than usual. Clara told him twice he was an idiot. He told her she was probably right. He kept going. On the 5th morning, she brought his coffee out to where he was standing at the fence line talking to one of the ranch hands, and he took it from her without breaking conversation. And the ranch hand watched this exchange and then looked away quickly with the expression of a man carefully noticing nothing. Clara walked back to the house, and she heard the ranch hand say something low that made Thomas go quiet, and she decided she did not need to know what was said. But that evening Thomas came in for supper with something different in his bearing, a looseness almost. Like a decision had been quietly made while his hands were busy with something else. He sat at the head of the table. The children filled in around him. Clara set the pot down and took her seat, the one that had simply become hers over the past weeks. Second from the end, across from Grace. And supper happened the way supper happened in a house that was functioning. Noise and spillage, and someone's elbow in someone else's ribs, and Henry reading a letter he'd gotten from the school teacher about advanced examinations, and Emma feeding a piece of biscuit to the rabbit under the table when she thought no one was watching. "Emma," Thomas said without looking up from his own plate. Emma's hand froze under the table. "Yes, Papa." "The rabbits had enough biscuit." Emma withdrew her hand with tremendous dignity and said nothing. Samuel swallowed a laugh. Benjamin didn't bother swallowing his. It was the most ordinary evening of Clara's entire time at the ranch, and it was without competition the best one. After the children were in bed, Thomas knocked on the doorframe of the kitchen where Clara was finishing the washing up. He had something in his hands, small, held carefully in the particular way men held things they'd made themselves and were not entirely sure would be received well. "I've been working on something," he said. "In the evenings, when the arm allows." He held it out. It was a small wooden carving, rough in the way handmade things were rough but deliberate, every line of it. A figure, small, a woman with one hand extended, and beside her, shorter, a child holding on. Clara took it and turned it in her hands. The grain of the wood was smooth where it had been finished, and the two figures were close enough together that they almost appeared to be leaning toward each other. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "It's not fine work," Thomas said. "I know that. The hands aren't right. I tried 4 times to get the hands right and couldn't manage it with one good arm, so I just..." He stopped. "I wanted to make something. I needed something to do with my hands while I was supposed to be resting." He paused again. "And I wanted you to have something that was mine, not the ranch's, not the children's. Something I made that was just for you." Clara looked up from the carving. Thomas stood in the doorway with his splinted arm against his chest and the particular expression of a man who'd said something honest and was waiting to find out what it cost him. "It's the hands," she said. He blinked. "What? The hands are right." She held it up, the two figures close together, the smaller one holding on. "You got the hands exactly right." Something happened to his face, then slow and irreversible, like a thing that had been frozen for a long time starting to come loose. "Clara," he said. Just her name. No title in front of it the first time he'd dropped it, the first time she'd heard it from him like that without the formal buffer between them. "Thomas," she said. "I need to say something, and I need to say it straight, because I've been going around it for 3 weeks and I'm not..." He exhaled. "I'm not built for going around things." "I know," she said. "Neither am I." "Then I'll say it straight." He held her gaze without flinching, this man who went into storms and fixed hinges and made small wooden figures and didn't know how to be anything but exactly who he was. "I asked you to stay for the children. That was the truth when I asked it. But it's not the whole truth anymore, and I'm not willing to let you keep thinking it is. A pause. I want you to stay for me. Because somewhere in the last 2 months, I stopped being able to imagine this house without you in it. And I don't think that's got anything to do with the bank or Richard or any of the rest of it. I think it's got to do with you. Clara set the carving down on the table with both hands, carefully the way you set down something you intended to keep. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know. I've known for a while. She met his eyes steadily. I was waiting for you to catch up. The look on his face surprised first, then something so undefended it was almost hard to look at directly, and then the slow, cautious unfurling of a man allowing himself to believe something good was actually happening was something Clara would carry for the rest of her life. Is that a yes? He said. Ask me properly and find out, she said. He stepped into the kitchen, and this time when he held her gaze, there was nothing held back in it. No armor, no distance, no grief standing between them like a third person in the room. Just a man who had learned slowly and at great cost how to be present again. Clara Bennett, he said, will you stay as my wife, as the mother of my children, if they'll have you, and I think they'll have you, as the woman I want beside me for whatever comes next? He paused. Will you stay? Yes, she said, simply, without hesitation. Yes, Thomas, I'll stay. He reached out with his good hand and took hers, and they stood in the kitchen, in the quiet of a house where 5 children were sleeping, and Clara thought about the boarding house in Harrisburg, and the advertisement in the back of a newspaper, and 300 miles of train and rattling stagecoach, and thought that if she'd known this was where she was going, she might not have been afraid at all. The children found out the next morning. Thomas told them at breakfast, which Clara would later reflect was either the best or the worst possible setting for significant family news, because there was nowhere for anyone's reaction to go unwitnessed, and the twins were already at the table, which meant the next 30 seconds were going to be whatever they were going to be in front of everyone simultaneously. Thomas said it plainly, the way he said everything. Miss Clara has agreed to marry me. She's going to stay not as a housekeeper, but as my wife. I wanted you all to hear it from me. 3 seconds of silence. Samuel's fork hit his plate. I knew it, he said, pointing at Benjamin. I told you. You did not, Benjamin said. I said it 3 days ago. I said Miss Clara was going to be our... You said you thought she might. You didn't say you knew. It's the same thing. It is not. Boys, Thomas said. They stopped. Grace looked up from her plate slowly, and her eyes were bright, not with surprise, but with the careful joy of a girl who'd been hoping for something and was only now allowing herself to believe she was going to get it. She looked at Clara across the table. Will you still teach me? She asked. The sewing and the rest. Will that still... She stopped, and Clara could see her searching for the right way to ask what she actually meant, which was not really about sewing at all. Everything stays, Clara said. All of it. It just becomes official. Grace nodded, once pressed her lips together, and looked back at her plate, and Clara could see her working very hard not to cry in front of her brothers. Emma, who had been listening to all of this from her chair with the rabbit on the table in front of her, and the focused expression of someone processing complicated information, put both her small hands flat on the table and looked at Clara and said, Does that mean you're my mama now? The table went completely still. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Emma. It means, Clara said carefully, because the word deserved care, that I love you like you're mine, and I'll be here every morning when you wake up and every night when you go to sleep for as long as I live. What you call me is up to you. There's no wrong answer. Emma thought about this with the judicial seriousness that characterized every important decision she made. She picked up her rabbit, held it against her chest, and said, I'll think about it. Take your time, Clara said. Everyone looked at Henry. Henry had not said a word since Thomas had spoken. He was looking at his plate, the same closed, guarded expression he'd worn on the first day Clara arrived, when he'd told her straight to her face that she'd leave just like the others, and there was no sense pretending different. "Henry," Thomas said quietly. Henry looked up. He looked at his father first, then at Clara, and whatever he was working through, it was something significant. She could see the whole machinery of it turning behind his eyes. The resistance, and the grief, and the wanting, and the fear of what happened when you wanted something, and it went wrong. "I meant what I said before," he said finally, "about not needing a new mother." "I know," Clara said. "I don't take it back." "I'm not asking you to." A long pause. Henry's jaw worked. "But I reckon," he said slowly, and something in his voice had shifted, not soft exactly. Henry didn't have a soft gear, but something had opened in it. "I reckon a man can change his mind about a thing without it meaning anything except that he thought about it harder." "That's true," Clara said. "That's a sign of good judgment." Henry met her eyes for a moment. Something passed between them. Not resolution exactly, but the beginning of something that could become resolution with enough time and enough honesty. "You gonna keep making biscuits?" he said. "Every morning," she said. He picked his fork back up and returned to his breakfast. "All right then," he said. The twins erupted simultaneously with commentary. Grace laughed for the first time since Richard's visit, a real laugh, the kind she kept stored somewhere private. Emma put the rabbit down, picked up her own fork and said with great authority, and to no one in particular, "I want a yellow dress for the wedding." Thomas caught Clara's eye across the table, and the look on his face was something she hadn't seen there before. Not relief, not gratitude, not even happiness exactly, but the wider, quieter thing those were all parts of. The look of a man who had come back to himself. Callahan came to the house on a Tuesday. He didn't send word. He simply arrived mid-morning, riding up the drive with the same unhurried certainty he'd had the first day Clara had seen him, and he hitched his horse at the post and walked to the door like a man who had not yet been told that the ground had shifted under his feet. Thomas answered the door. Clara stood behind him, not hiding, just present, a foot inside the hallway within earshot, which was exactly where she intended to be. Callahan took one look at Thomas's arm in the sling at the order behind him, in the house at Clara, standing in the hall, and something flickered across his face before he contained it. "Whitaker," he said, "I heard about your accident. Wanted to check in." "Did you?" Thomas said. "Community concern." Callahan smiled the smile of a man who'd refined insincerity into an art form. "I also wanted to discuss the terms of the note given the note's been settled," Thomas said. A beat of silence. Something went through Callahan's face quickly, but not quickly enough. "Settled?" he repeated. "In full, this morning." Thomas reached into his jacket with his good hand and produced a letter, the bank's own letterhead, the kind of document that left no interpretation open. "My brother-in-law, Richard Howard, cleared the balance. I imagine you'll be notified by the bank directly." He held the letter where Callahan could see it without handing it to him. "So there's no longer any business between us, Mr. Callahan. Not about the note, and not about anything else." Callahan looked at the letter. His expression had done something complicated and arrived somewhere that was trying to look like indifference and wasn't quite making it. "Richard Howard," he said as if tasting the name. "The same man you've been writing to for the past 3 months, Thomas said, and his voice had gone very quiet and very level in the particular way it went when he was most serious. "The same man whose grief you used as a lever to try to take this land. He sends his regards. He also sends notice that he's retained a lawyer in Billings to review any correspondence between you and his office over the past year." A pause. "In case anything needs to be addressed." Callahan looked at Thomas for a long moment. The easy confidence had gone somewhere, replaced by something recalibrating. "A lawyer's an expensive thing to retain over a personal matter," he said. "Richard Howard can afford it," Thomas said. "And some things are worth the expense." Another silence. Callahan's gaze moved past Thomas to Clara, and he looked at her with the particular look of a man reassessing a situation that had not gone the way he'd planned it. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "I trust everything is satisfactory with your position." "My position," Clara said, is exactly what it should be. Thank you for your concern. Something in Callahan's face hardened. Not anger, not quite, but the look of a man who has lost a hand and knows it, and is already thinking 3 moves ahead to the next game. He touched his hat brim, looked at Thomas. "Congratulations on your good fortune," he said, and he put enough silk on it that you almost couldn't hear the steel underneath. "Good day to you." He turned and walked to his horse with the unhurried step of a man who still believed he was in control of the pace of things, and he rode down the drive at the same easy trot he'd arrived at and didn't look back. Thomas closed the door. Clara exhaled. "That's not the last of him," she said. "No?" Thomas agreed. Men like that don't stop because the first thing didn't work. They stop when there's nothing left worth taking. He turned and looked at her. "But we took away his leverage. That's the most important thing." "The lawyer," she said. "Is that real?" Richard mentioned it before he left. He was angrier about being used than he let on to Callahan. Angrier at himself mostly. Thomas leaned against the door. "He's not a bad man. He made bad choices because he was grieving and someone handed him a direction to aim it." "People do that," Clara said. "Yeah." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't, when you had every reason to." She didn't answer that because it didn't need answering. She went back to the kitchen, and Thomas followed, and they had coffee standing at the counter, the way they'd taken to doing on mornings when the children were occupied, not talking much, just present in the same space, which was its own kind of conversation. The news of the engagement spread through Larkspur the way news spread in small towns without anyone seeming to carry it, just moving from house to house on its own current, until by the end of the week, there wasn't a soul within 20 miles who hadn't heard it. The reactions came in various forms. Several of the women who'd been at the church social sent food, which Clara suspected was as much curiosity as congratulation, but accepted in the spirit it was presented. The schoolteacher, Miss Alderman, came by specifically to shake Clara's hand, and said with feeling that she'd never seen the Whittaker children so focused in class, and whatever Clara was doing, she hoped she'd keep doing it. Margaret Alcott came too. Clara was in the yard when the woman arrived, and she saw her coming, and had exactly long enough to decide whether to go inside or stay where she was. She stayed where she was. Mrs. Alcott approached with the careful bearing of a woman who'd prepared something to say. She stopped a few feet away, looked at Clara, and then, unexpectedly genuinely, the preparation seemed to fall off her. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "When I came to the house before I was unkind, I suggested things that weren't mine to suggest." Clara looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said because it was true, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest, and she had no patience left for dishonesty. "You did." Mrs. Alcott absorbed this without flinching. "I was wrong. I knew Thomas Whittaker's wife. Margaret was a good woman and a good friend to me, and I think I was trying to protect her memory in the wrong direction." She paused. "From what I can see, you've taken care of her children and her husband better than this town managed to in 2 years. "Her children did most of it themselves," Clara said. "They just needed someone to be consistent." "That may be," Mrs. Alcott said, "but consistent is something that had to show up to do it, and you showed up." She held out her hand. "Congratulations, Miss Bennet. I hope you'll be happy here." Clara looked at the hand. Then she took it. "Thank you, Mrs. Alcott." The woman left, and Clara stood in the yard for a moment alone, and thought about how strange it was that the place she'd tried hardest to leave on the day she arrived was the place she was now deliberately, and with full knowledge, choosing to stay in. The engagement was short. Thomas was not a man for long engagements, not because he was impatient, but because he was practical. The ranch needed order. The children needed certainty, and both of those things came faster with a decision made than a decision pending. Clara agreed with him because she had never been a woman who needed a long time to be sure of a thing once she was sure. 3 weeks after Callahan's visit, the Reverend came to the ranch. It was a Wednesday, which nobody had planned, but which Clara would always remember as the right day for it. An ordinary day, a working day, a day that proved this wasn't a performance or an occasion, but simply the next right thing in a life being built carefully and on purpose. Grace made her wear a piece of blue ribbon in her hair because blue was the right color, and this was not negotiable. Emma wore the yellow dress that had taken Clara 6 evenings to finish, and wore it with the gravity of someone fulfilling a long-standing contractual obligation. The twins wore their good shirts and had their hair combed with enough water to stick, though. By the time the Reverend arrived, Samuels had already rebelled on one side, and Benjamin appeared to have given up the pretense entirely. Henry stood beside his father. He'd asked to the night before, coming to Thomas quietly after supper and standing in the doorway of the study, the way he stood in doorways when he was working up to something. Thomas looked up from the accounts he'd been going over. "I want to stand with you," Henry said. "Tomorrow. I want to stand beside you." Thomas set down his pencil. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." Henry nodded once with the economical grace of a boy learning how to carry things instead of just holding them. "Good," he said, and went to bed. The ceremony was short, real and short, which was the best kind of ceremony. The Reverend spoke about commitment and family, and the courage it took to choose love in the aftermath of loss, and Clara stood beside Thomas in the front room of the house that had once been the saddest place she'd ever walked into, and she said yes to all of it, with the clarity of a woman who knew exactly what she was saying yes to. When it was done, Emma pushed her way to Clara's side before anyone else could speak, took her hand with both of hers, and looked up at her with the particular seriousness of a child who'd spent a long time thinking about something. "I decided," Emma said. "Did you?" "Yes." She held Clara's gaze steady and certain. "Mama." "That's what I decided." Clara's throat closed. She crouched down, so they were eye level, this woman who had traveled 300 miles, looking for honest work and a roof that wouldn't disappear from under her, and this small girl who had survived loss and fear and the particular cruelty of a world that didn't wait for children to be ready. And she held Emma's face in both her hands, the way she would have held something irreplaceable. "Mama," she said, trying it out. "I like that." Emma's face broke open into the widest smile Clara had ever seen on her. She threw both arms around Clara's neck and held on the way. She'd held on at the very beginning, at the very first moment, with everything she had, refusing to let go. Thomas put his good hand on Clara's shoulder, and Henry stood beside him, and Grace made a sound that might have been a sob if you caught it from the right angle, and the twins were already in the kitchen investigating whether there was cake. And the Reverend shook Thomas's hand and said, "God bless you all," and found his hat. And Clara knelt on the floor of the Whitaker Ranch with a 5-year-old's arms around her neck and felt for the first time in 6 years that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not passing through, not managing someone else's life until the next position opened up, but here wholly and permanently, and by her own free choice, in a place that had become hers, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had looked at everything it was and everything it needed and said yes anyway. Outside, the ranch hand who'd been watching the horses during the ceremony came up from the barn and saw the Reverend leaving, and he took his hat off and held it against his chest in the particular way men did when they were marking something they recognized as significant. And he stood there in the morning light looking at the house and thinking that it looked different than it had 6 weeks ago, and he couldn't have said exactly what the difference was, only that whatever had been missing was there now. The note on Callahan's bank was settled. Richard Howard was on a train back to Boston with a promise to visit in the spring. The children were fed and warm and accounted for, and one by one in their different ways, beginning to remember how to simply be themselves, instead of people bracing for the next loss. And inside the house in the kitchen, the twins had found the cake. The cake was gone by noon. Benjamin had gotten there first, which Samuel disputed loudly and at length, and the argument about who had taken the larger slice carried through the kitchen and out into the yard, and was only resolved when Clara appeared in the doorway and told them both that if they wanted another piece, there would be no more cake at all, and the threat of that was sufficient to produce an immediate and sincere peace between them that lasted the rest of the afternoon. It was a Wednesday. An ordinary Wednesday, now also the day Clara Whitaker, She turned the name over in her mind like a new coin, feeling its weight had made permanent what had already been true for weeks. The Reverend had gone. The ranch hands had gone back to their work. The house had settled back into itself, and life as it always did resumed. Thomas found her in the kitchen an hour after the ceremony, washing the good dishes she'd brought out for the occasion. He stood in the doorway with his sling off. The doctor had cleared him that morning. The bone healed cleaner than expected, and he watched her for a moment before she heard him. "You should leave those," he said. "They won't wash themselves." "Clara." She turned. He was looking at her with that particular expression she'd come to know, the one that meant he had something to say, and was deciding how to say it without making it larger than it needed to be, because he was a man who didn't like making things larger than they needed to be. "It's our wedding day," he said. She considered that. "Set the dish down." "Fair point," she said. He smiled, the real one. The one that had taken 6 weeks to surface, and now appeared with the ease of something that had always been there just waiting to be let out. He crossed the kitchen, took her hand the way he'd started taking it, like it was something he'd earned and intended to keep, and they sat together at the table in the quiet of an afternoon that belonged entirely to them. "Are you scared?" he asked. The question surprised her, not because it was wrong, but because he'd asked it, because Thomas Whitaker, who went into storms and set broken bones and faced bankers on his porch without flinching, was asking her if she was scared, as if her answer genuinely mattered to him. "A little," she admitted. "Not of this. Of whether I'll be enough. Whether I'll do right by them, by all of you." "You already have," he said. "That was the easy part," she said. "The easy part is showing up when things are bad enough that anything is better than nothing. The hard part is being enough when things are good, when they don't need rescuing, when it's just Tuesday." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "My wife Margaret, she used to say that the marriage wasn't in the big moments, it was in the Tuesdays." He looked at the table. "I didn't understand that when she said it. I thought she meant something small. I understand it now." "She was right," Clara said. "She usually was." He lifted his eyes. "I think you two would have been the same kind of right about the same kind of things. It would have been insufferable." Clara laughed genuinely, and the laugh surprised her the way real laughter sometimes did. Thomas watched her laugh with the look of a man who has discovered something he intends to spend a great deal of time cultivating. "Good," he said. "I want to hear that more." She shook her head, still smiling. "You're different than you were on that porch the first day." "So are you," he said. That was true. She knew it was true the way she knew things about herself that only showed up when she looked at them sideways, not head-on, but in the space between one moment and the next. The woman who'd stepped off that supply wagon with one suitcase and a fistful of betrayed expectations had been someone holding herself so carefully that she'd forgotten she was doing it. She'd forgotten what it felt like to put the whole of herself into a place and mean to stay. She remembered now. The Tuesdays came. The weeks after the wedding folded into each other with the particular rhythm of a house that has found its footing not without difficulty, not without the inevitable friction of 5 children and 2 adults learning to be a single thing, but with the steady accumulating quality of something being built correctly. Henry was the last to fully let go of the distance he'd kept. Not because he was cruel, and not because he didn't care. Clara had understood for a long time that Henry cared enormously about everything, which was precisely why he was so careful about showing it. He was 12 years old, and he had learned the hard way that the things you showed were the things that could be taken from you. He had learned that the year his mother died, and he hadn't unlearned it yet. The thing that finally moved him had nothing to do with Clara directly. It had to do with a letter. 6 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived from the school district in Billings. Henry had sat the advanced examinations the teacher had mentioned, the ones he'd been studying toward since before Clara arrived, and the results had come back. He'd not only passed, he'd placed in the top 3 scores in the district. Thomas called him into the study to tell him and Clara heard it happen from the hallway where she was passing with a pile of mended laundry. She heard Thomas say the words, heard the careful, measured pride in his voice, and then she heard something she had never heard from Henry before. She heard him cry, not loud. Henry would never do anything loud that he could do quietly, but she heard it, the particular rough sound of a boy who'd held something so tightly for so long that the release came out broken. She heard Thomas's chair push back. She heard the low sound of a man saying something to his son that wasn't loud enough to travel past the door and didn't need to be. She went on down the hallway with the laundry. Some things needed no witnesses to be real. But that evening, Henry came and found her on the back porch where she'd gone to take a few minutes in the cooling air before the supper rush. He sat down beside her without explanation, and they looked at the last light going out of the sky together in silence. Then he said, "I got the scores back." "I heard," she said. "Your father told me." A pause. "I've been studying since last spring," Henry said. "Before you came. Nobody knew I was doing it. I didn't want anyone to know in case I failed." "That makes sense," she said. "My mother would have—" He stopped, started again. "She would have been glad about it." "Yes," Clara said. "She would have been very glad." Another pause, longer this time. The kind of silence that had texture to it. "Wait. I'm glad you stayed," Henry said. He didn't look at her when he said it. He said it looking at the horizon in the same flat, direct tone he used for everything, as if the only way he could deliver something that mattered to him was to treat it like a plain fact. "I said you'd leave. I was wrong. I'm not wrong that often, so I want to acknowledge it when I am." Clara looked at the side of his face, this boy, with his mother's grief and his father's stubbornness and his own specific private kind of courage. "I'm glad I stayed too," she said. "And for what it's worth, Henry, I don't think being careful about who you trust is the same as being wrong. It's just being careful. The world gave you reasons to be careful." He was quiet for a moment. "You gave me a reason not to be," he said. She didn't answer that because it didn't need an answer. She just sat with him until the last light was gone, and then they went inside, and she put supper on the table, and Henry ate 3 portions, and accused Benjamin of cheating at the card game they played afterward, and everything was exactly as it should be. The first real test came in November. It came in the form of a document delivered by a writer from town on a Thursday afternoon, while Thomas was out in the far field, and Clara was alone in the house with Emma and Grace. The writer handed it to her at the door, with the expression of a man who didn't know what was in it, but could tell from its provenance that it wasn't good news. It was from the county court. It bore Callahan's lawyer's name in the return address. Clara read it twice, standing in the doorway with Emma tugging at her skirt, asking what it was. It was a challenge to the land title. Callahan, having lost his leverage over the banknote, had pivoted, had found or manufactured a claim that a portion of the north pasture acreage had been improperly recorded in the original deed, and that the corrected boundary would place a significant strip of Whitaker land under disputed ownership. The filing was elaborate, the legal language dense, and the intent unmistakable. He couldn't take the ranch through debt. He was going to try to take pieces of it through paperwork. "Clara," Grace said from behind her, reading her face. "What's wrong?" Clara folded the document. "Nothing we can't handle," she said. "Get your coat. I need you to ride to the far field and bring your father home." Grace didn't ask twice. She had her coat on and was out the door in 30 seconds. Clara sat down at the table, unfolded the document again, and read it a third time slowly, with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 6 years in other people's houses, listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to be listening to, including more than one conversation about property and deeds, and the creative ways men with money used paper to take things from men without it. By the time Thomas came in through the back door, she had written 4 pages of notes in her clearest hand and had the original deed to the ranch which she'd found in the study 2 weeks after arriving in a state of precarious disorder that she'd immediately reorganized open on the table beside the Callahan document. Thomas read the filing. His face went through several things without settling on any of them. Then he set it down. "He's not going to stop," Thomas said. "No," Clara agreed. "But look at this." She put her notes beside the filing, and the deed beside both. "The boundary he's claiming is improperly recorded. Look at the survey date on the original. The county resurveyed this entire area in 1879. Callahan's challenge is based on the pre-survey description, which was superseded. Any lawyer worth hiring should be able to have this dismissed. Thomas stared at what she'd laid out. Then he looked at her. "How did you know where the deed was?" he said. "I reorganized the study in the 3rd week," she said. "I know where everything in this house is." Something moved across his face, not just gratitude, deeper than that. The specific look of a man realizing for perhaps the first time what it meant to have a partner rather than a household employee. "I need to ride to Billings and find a lawyer," he said. "Write to Richard first," Clara said. "He has one already retained. That's faster and cheaper." Thomas sat down. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. "Clara." "Don't," she said, because she could see he was about to say something large and grateful, and she didn't want it right now. "Write the letter. We'll deal with the rest later." He wrote the letter. Richard Howard's lawyer in Billings responded within the week. The challenge was filed against within the month. Callahan's claim, built on outdated survey data and the assumption that Thomas Whitaker was a man without resources or allies, collapsed under examination like paper in rain. The county court dismissed it on a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, just like Margaret Whitaker had always said. Thomas came home from town that afternoon with the dismissal order in his jacket pocket, and something in his face that Clara recognized as the particular relief of a man who has stopped bracing for impact. He found her in the kitchen. She was teaching Emma her letters at the table. Emma's tongue between her teeth in concentration, and he stopped in the doorway and held up the paper. Clara looked at it. Then she looked at his face. "It's done," she said. "It's done." Emma looked up. "What's done?" "Something that needed to be finished," Thomas said, coming in and sitting down beside his daughter. He looked at the letters she'd been practicing, traced one with his finger. "You're getting better at these." "Clara makes me do them 10 times, Emma said. "Even the ones I already know." "That sounds right," Thomas said. "It's a lot," Emma said. "Most good things are," he said. Emma considered this and appeared to find it unsatisfying but not worth arguing. She picked up her pencil and did the next letter. The second twist that November wasn't from Callahan. It came from somewhere no one had seen. It came from Emma. She woke 3 weeks after the court dismissal with a fever that climbed fast and didn't stop, the kind of fever that arrived without warning and moved with a speed that made the bottom drop out of a parent's stomach, because everyone in that house knew what fever could do. They had all lived through what fever could do. Clara was with her within minutes of the first sound from the room. Thomas was right behind her. And in the particular terrible quiet of sitting beside a sick child and waiting and watching and measuring temperature and administering what could be administered and praying for the ones who had to be left to faith, something happened between Thomas and Clara that no wedding ceremony had quite produced. They didn't sleep. Either of them. They took turns beside Emma's bed, and between turns they sat together at the top of the stairs, not talking much, just present in the way that presence was its own action, choosing to be awake in the same darkness, choosing not to carry the fear separately. On the second night, somewhere past midnight, Thomas said into the silence, "I did this alone before. When Margaret was sick." His voice was stripped of everything except the memory itself. "I sat beside her bed and I didn't know what to do, and I couldn't. I couldn't make it stop. And when it was over, I thought I'd never—" He stopped, steadied himself. "I thought I'd never be able to sit beside someone I loved in this kind of night again." Clara reached over and took his hand. Not to say anything, just to be there. "She's going to be all right," Clara said, not because she knew it, because some things needed to be said out loud to make room for them to be true. Thomas held her hand and didn't answer. Emma's fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. It broke, the way fevers broke, when they decided to suddenly the heat going out of a child's skin, and the color coming back, small eyes opening and focusing, and the first word out of her mouth being with characteristic Emma authority. "I'm hungry." Thomas laughed. The laugh cracked somewhere in the middle, and he pressed the back of his hand to his mouth for a second, and Clara put her arm around his shoulders, and let him take a moment before Emma could see his face. "There's biscuits," Clara told Emma. "Can you wait 5 minutes?" "I suppose," Emma said with the tone of someone for whom 5 minutes was a significant concession. Henry appeared in the doorway behind them. He'd been awake too, Clara suspected, for at least part of those 3 nights, though he'd never said so. He looked at Emma, assessed her color, her posture, the fact that she was already negotiating about biscuits, and the rigidity went out of his shoulders all at once. "She's fine," he said. "She's fine," Clara confirmed. He nodded, turned and went back down the hallway. She heard him tell the twins in a voice scraped rough from something he'd never name. "She's fine. Get up. We've got chores." The sound of the twins getting up. The sound of the house resuming. Clara looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Clara. And between them, in that exhausted, grateful, utterly ordinary moment, at the top of the morning with a recovered child demanding biscuits behind them, something that had already been real became something else. Something forged the way things were forged when they'd been through heat and hadn't broken. Callahan left Larkspur in February. Nobody announced it. He simply wasn't there one morning when the feed store opened, and by afternoon, the rumor had circulated that he'd taken a position in another county, somewhere farther east, where presumably there was other land he believed he had a claim on. The man who'd ridden up to the Whitaker porch with papers and a casual cruelty born of confidence departed without ceremony or acknowledgement, and life in Larkspur proceeded as if he'd never been particularly central to it, which was perhaps the most fitting end he could have gotten. Thomas heard it in town. He came home and told Clara, and she nodded once finished what she was doing, and that was that. Some things ended not with confrontation, but with weather. They simply moved on, and you woke up one day to find the sky different. The spring arrived. Richard Howard arrived with it as he'd promised on a Thursday in April this time, with advance notice, a proper letter that gave them a week to prepare, arriving not as an assessor, but as family. He brought Grace a book of botanical illustrations she'd mentioned once casually in a letter she hadn't thought he'd been paying attention to. He brought the twins a set of proper playing cards with a note that said, "So you stop cheating each other with that worn-out deck." He brought Henry a small penknife with a carved handle. Good quality, the kind you gave a boy you were beginning to think of as someone worth investing in. He brought Emma a small painting, not large, hardly bigger than his palm, of a woman with dark hair, laughing at something beyond the frame. He crouched down to Emma's level when he handed it to her and said, "That's your mother, when she was 17. I had it made from a photograph." Emma looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Richard. "She looks nice," she said. "She was wonderful," Richard said, and his voice only cracked a little. "Clara says she would have liked me," Emma told him. "She absolutely would have," Richard said. "She would have called you a handful with the best possible intentions." Emma seemed to take this as a high compliment. She went and put the painting on her windowsill, where the morning light could reach it. That evening after supper, Richard sat on the porch with Thomas and Clara, the 3 of them with coffee. The children's voices drifting from inside the twins, arguing about the card game with their new deck. Grace reading aloud to Emma from the botanical book, Henry at the kitchen table, working through a mathematics problem with the focused silence of someone who found numbers restful. "I owe you both an apology," Richard said unprompted, looking out at the land going blue and gold in the last of the daylight. "Not the polite kind, a real one." He turned to Thomas. "I spent 2 years angry at this place for taking my sister, and I let that anger make me easy to use. Callahan couldn't have done half of what he did if I hadn't handed him the door." He paused. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would have told you herself eventually." "She always did," Richard said. "Still does," Thomas said. "In different ways." Richard looked at the house behind them, where the sounds of his sister's children lived, and he didn't say anything for a while, and nobody required him to. Then he said, "I'd like to come back, if that's all right. In the fall, maybe, and again after that." "This is family," Clara said. "Family comes back." He looked at her for a moment, then looked away at the land, and there was something in his face that was almost peace, or the approach of it, the first light of it on the horizon. May came, and with it a development nobody had foreseen. Henry, at nearly 13, had begun receiving correspondence from the school district in Billings about a scholarship program for exceptional students' correspondence that had initially been addressed to Thomas, but which Henry had started answering himself in his careful formal hand because it concerned him, and he was, as he'd made clear on more than one occasion, not a child to be managed. He brought the most recent letter to supper on a Tuesday evening, set it beside his plate, and looked at Thomas and Clara with the expression of someone about to say something important in the least dramatic way possible. "There's a school," he said, "in Billings, for the fall term, full scholarship, room and board." He set his fork down. "I want to go." The table went quiet. Clara had known something like this was coming. She'd seen the examinations, she'd seen his scores, she'd seen the way his mind worked, when it had real material to work with, the kind of mind that would eventually outgrow what Larkspur could offer it, through no fault of Larkspur. She'd known. She'd just hadn't known when. Thomas looked at the letter, then at his son. "Billings is a day's ride," he said. "I know. You'd be gone through the school year." "I know. Henry." Thomas's voice was even, but Clara could hear everything underneath it, the pride and the grief, and the wanting to hold on, and the understanding that holding on was precisely the wrong thing to do. "Is this what you want?" Henry looked at his father for a long moment, and then at Clara, and then back at Thomas. "Mama always said she wanted us to become more than the land gave us," he said quietly. "She said the land was the beginning, not the end. That it was what you built from, not what you built toward." Thomas pressed his mouth together. Clara put her hand on his arm under the table, and he turned it over and held it without looking away from his son. "She said that—" Thomas confirmed, his voice rough. "So," Henry picked his fork back up, "I'm going to go." "Yes," Thomas said, "you are." The twins immediately began calculating how to redistribute Henry's chores between them in a manner that favored each of them individually, which led to an argument of such specialized complexity that Grace finally intervened with a ruling so decisive that even Samuel accepted it, and Emma declared that Henry going to school meant she was going to take his room because it was bigger, which Henry said absolutely not, and life at the Whitaker Ranch continued in exactly the fashion it had established for itself, loud and warm and imperfect, and entirely, completely alive. The night before Henry left for Billings, Clara found him in the barn sitting on the same hay bale he'd been sitting on in the dark that first morning she'd come in and found him there. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting. She sat down on the same crate she'd used then. "You ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Scared." A pause. Henry didn't admit to being scared easily, and she knew that, and she waited. "Some," he said. "Good," she said. "The ones who aren't scared aren't paying attention." He was quiet for a moment. "I know I wasn't easy," he said. "When you came, I made it harder than it needed to be." "You made it exactly as hard as it needed to be," Clara said. "I didn't need it easy. I needed it real. You gave me real." Henry looked at her sidelong, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand without appearing to study them. "You're a strange woman," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I mean that well," he said. "I know you do." He stood up because Henry expressed things by moving through them rather than sitting in them. He picked up his hat from the post. He looked at her for a moment, with everything he felt about the last 7 months moving through his face in the compressed, controlled way Henry felt things present but contained like weather held in a jar. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for—" He stopped. "For making this place what it is now." Clara stood too. She looked at this boy who was becoming something real and particular and entirely his own, and she thought about the morning she'd almost left, about the weight of one small hand refusing to let go, and about all the moments between then and now that had built stone by stone into the life she was standing inside. "You helped make it," she said. Every one of you. You didn't need rescuing. You needed somebody to show up and stay. That's all. You did the rest." Henry put his hat on. He gave her one nod, the Henry nod, the one that meant more than most people's paragraphs, and walked out of the barn. She heard him go into the house. She heard Emma's voice rise immediately in protest about something. She heard the twins weigh in. She heard Grace tell everyone to be quiet because she was trying to read. She heard Thomas's voice, low and steady calling order, with the ease of a man who had found his way back to his own house and intended to stay in it. Clara stood alone in the barn for one quiet minute in the particular stillness of a life that had settled around her like something custom-made, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. Because she had chosen it with open eyes, and it had chosen her back, and that exchange made in full knowledge of the cost and the risk and the work ahead was the only kind that ever held. She had come to Whitaker Ranch with a single suitcase and the worn-down certainty that she had nowhere left to belong. She walked back to the house in the April dark, toward the light coming from every window, toward the noise of 5 people who called her name, like it was a word they'd always known, toward the man who had looked at her across a porch railing in the worst month of his life and asked her, not with elegance, not with promises he couldn't keep, but with the plain exhausted honesty of someone who had nothing left to offer but the truth to stay. And she had. And everything that mattered had followed from that single quiet, world-changing yes. The Whitaker Ranch did not become a legend. It did not become a story people told with wonder or embellishment. It became something more durable than that. It became the place people in Larkspur pointed to when they needed to remember that broken things could be rebuilt, not back to what they were, but forward into something stronger, and that the person who saved a family didn't always arrive on horseback with a plan. Sometimes she arrived on a supply wagon with a suitcase nearly turned around at the door, and was held in place by the small hand of a child who had simply decided, with the uncompromising certainty of someone who had already lost too much, that this stranger was going to stay. Emma was right. She always was.